My parents said they couldn't afford a coat for me but bought matching ones for the others a week later. I was 15. I remember the frostbite more than the birthdays. It was late November when I learned how deeply people could love selectively and how silence could hurt louder than shouting. My name is Evelyn Ross, and at 15, I was invisible in my own house. Not in a dramatic, scream into a pillow way, more like the slow fading of a photograph left too long in the sun. You wouldn't notice unless you were really looking. And nobody in my house ever was. My father, Mark Ross, used to read me bedtime stories when I was small, before the divorce, before the new wife and the new daughters, before his laugh changed hollowed out and became a sound I didn't recognize anymore. After the divorce, he remarried fast. Vanessa, my stepmother, brought two daughters into the house, Ivy, 14, and Sienna, 10, both slim, chatty, all glitter and high-pitched giggles. I wasn't jealous at first. I figured maybe this time we'd be a real family again. But I was wrong. Very wrong. Vanessa was the kind of woman who smiled with her lips and measured love in performances. She called me sweetheart with the tone you'd use to speak to a stranger's annoying dog. Ivy and Sienna got warm pancakes on Saturdays. I got sticky notes reminding me to clean the baseboards. That winter, my old coat gave out. The zipper stuck halfway and the lining had ripped. We lived in upstate New York, where the wind cuts your skin raw and snow comes down like punishment. I asked Dad if we could go shopping for a new one. He rubbed his temples. Evie, money's tight right now. I nodded. I always nodded. That was the rule. Don't make a fuss. Don't be a problem. Don't be harder to love. But a week later, I walked through the front door, still shivering from my hoodie layers, and stopped dead in the hallway. There they were. Vanessa, Ivy, and Sienna twirling in matching winter coats. Long, plum-colored, down-filled with faux fur collars. The tags still dangled from the sleeves like price-shaped daggers. Vanessa laughed. Aren't they cute? Then she turned to me. Try not to freeze, sweetheart. My father stood behind them, holding a mug. He smiled like he didn't even see me. I went upstairs and sat on my bed, coatless, quiet. I'd already learned that anger wasn't allowed in that house. Sadness was ignored. Only silence was tolerated. And I was so good at being tolerated. That winter was the coldest one I could remember, not because of the temperature, but because of the way they looked through me, around me, past me. At school, my English teacher, Miss Griffin, noticed. I guess she saw the layers of sweatshirts, the way my hands never left my sleeves. She pulled me aside after class one day. Everything okay at home? I lied. Just forgot my coat. The next day, she handed me a bag. My daughter outgrew this last year. Thought you might need it. Inside was a navy blue coat, worn but warm. I almost cried, but I didn't, because I didn't know if I could stop. I wore that coat like armor. I wore it while washing dishes I didn't dirty, while vacuuming rooms I didn't use. I wore it while Ivy hosted friends and Vanessa brought out snacks for everyone but me. I wore it while Sienna called me the helper. That coat became the symbol of everything I didn't get from the people who were supposed to love me. By the time I was 17, I had 2 part-time jobs, morning shifts at the bakery and evenings restocking shelves at the hardware store. Every cent went into a savings jar under my bed. College wasn't even the dream. Escape was, and escape came. I got into Rock Hill State University. Not far, but far enough. I left home at 18 and never looked back. I stopped answering their calls. I figured they wouldn't notice, and for a long time, they didn't. College was hard, lonely, and liberating. I had nothing, but it was mine. My room, my rules, my breath. I made friends, slowly. One of them, Talia, became like a sister. She was loud where I was quiet, protective where I was cautious. She asked once why I flinched whenever someone raised their voice. I didn't answer. She never asked again. I graduated with a degree in education. Funny, isn't it? How people who were never protected end up wanting to protect others. I got a job at a local elementary school. Not glamorous, but steady. Years passed. I met someone. His name was Lucas, a nurse, kind, soft-spoken, the kind of man who always looked you in the eyes and meant it. He didn't save me. I'd already done that part. But he stayed. And that mattered more. We bought a fixer-upper in a small town, planted a garden, built bookshelves. We were building a life brick by quiet brick. It wasn't flashy, but it was warm. It was safe. And I had never known that feeling growing up. Then, one morning in early December, everything cracked open. A voicemail. Evelyn? It's Dad. Listen. Things aren't great. Vanessa lost her job. I've been sick, had surgery a few months back. We're out of options. The girls are grown now. But we need a place to stay. Just for a little while. Just like that. After a decade of silence. No apology. No explanation. Just need. Lucas found me frozen in the kitchen, phone still in my hand. What is it? My dad, I whispered. And what does he want? I told him. Lucas said nothing at first. Then he asked, What do you want? And that was the moment I realized I didn't know. The weeks after Evelyn turned 16 felt like walking through a blizzard without a map, each step forward, met with resistance, every breath swallowed by silence. In the Ross household, her presence was something to be endured, not embraced. Her father, Gregory Ross, worked long shifts at a metal fabrication plant outside of Albany. When he came home, he was either too tired or too disengaged to speak in more than one-word answers, dinners in the fridge, or lights off by 10. The warm, playful man who once read bedtime stories and made pancakes in funny shapes was gone, replaced by a shell molded by exhaustion and avoidance. And Evelyn had long stopped asking for attention from Meredith. Her stepmother's disdain wasn't loud, it was calculated. She never yelled, never struck Evelyn. She didn't have to. She erased her in more subtle, enduring ways. When guests came over, Meredith would only mention her own children, Thomas and Lily, as if Evelyn were a tenant and not a daughter in the house. Evelyn's chores always included cleaning up after Thomas's messy cereal mornings and washing the paint off Lily's hands when her after-school art projects took over the kitchen. But when Evelyn left a single mug in the sink, she'd find a passive-aggressive note on her door. This isn't a hotel. Pull your weight. That winter was unforgiving. Upstate New York always brought snowstorms that buried cars, turned driveways into icy death traps, and left the air biting. Evelyn had a coat, but it was a size too small and the zipper stuck halfway up. Meredith insisted it still fit fine and said, We all make sacrifices. Then one day, Evelyn came home from her part-time shift at a local coffee shop to find new coats hanging on the entryway rack, plush, thick parkas in matching navy blue. Thomas and Lily twirled in them like models on a runway. Meredith laughed and adjusted Lily's hood, the faux fur brushing her cheek like a crown. Evelyn tried to walk past unnoticed. Careful not to get jealous, Evie, Meredith said sweetly. These were a treat. She didn't answer. She just walked to her room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of her twin bed, staring at the beige wall. The heater clanked in the corner, but the room still felt frozen. A few days later, her boss at the cafe, May, noticed Evelyn rubbing her hands together while restocking napkins. You didn't bring gloves? May asked. Evelyn shrugged. May disappeared to the back and returned with a pair of her own old, but lined with fleece. Take them, she said. They're just sitting in my drawer. That gesture hit Evelyn like a flood. It was small, yes, but laced with something she hadn't felt in years, care, without strings. She wore those gloves like armor. By the time spring arrived, Evelyn had learned how to stretch $50 into 2 weeks of groceries, how to fix a loose doorknob with a butter knife, and how to disappear when Meredith was in a mood. She didn't speak much at school, and her classmates didn't ask why. But in her AP English class, her essays began to stand out. Miss Delacroix, a woman in her late 40s with unruly curls and a penchant for worn cardigans, started leaving detailed comments in the margins. Your perspective is sharp, she wrote once. Don't be afraid to use your voice. One afternoon, Miss Delacroix stopped Evelyn after class. Have you considered applying to Hudson River University's summer writing program? They offer full scholarships for students like you. Evelyn blinked. Students like me? Students who write truth into every sentence. Miss Delacroix smiled. And who know more about the world than they let on? That night, Evelyn filled out the application in pencil on lined notebook paper before transferring it neatly onto the online form at the library the next day. She didn't tell Meredith or her father. There was no point. If she got in, they'd say it wasn't practical. If she didn't, they'd just nod and move on. Weeks passed. Evelyn worked, studied, and lived in the cracks of other people's plans. Then, in early May, the acceptance email came. She'd won a full scholarship to the 6-week intensive. Meals included, dorm provided. It felt like being handed a golden key, but it also felt like standing on a cliff ready to jump, unsure if the ground would catch her. That weekend, she sat across from May during their shared break. I got into a writing program, she said carefully, voice low. I'd be gone for the summer. May leaned back, smiling. Good for you. I'll need to quit. May shook her head. No, you won't. I'll hold your spot. Go learn something. Then come back with better metaphors for how bad our coffee is. Evelyn smiled, really smiled, for the first time in months. That summer changed everything. At Hudson River University, Evelyn met other teens who saw the world like she did. She spent nights under string lights on dorm balconies, swapping stories with students who'd lived through foster care, immigration, small-town gossip, and big city silence. They wrote poems about grief, joy, and complicated mothers. Evelyn's writing deepened. It hurt, but in the way growing often does. She shared one essay aloud during a workshop. It was about a winter coat, about laughter that felt like exclusion, about the sharp sting of silence. When she finished, no one spoke for a beat. Then someone clapped, then another. Soon the whole room was applauding. A peer approached her after and said, "That made me feel less alone." It was the first time Evelyn realized her story might have power. When she returned home in August, something inside her had shifted. She wasn't scared of Meredith's cold eyes or her father's tired indifference anymore. Because now Evelyn Ross had a voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone mute it again. It wasn't just the cold that crept in that winter, it was the quiet. Evelyn often found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of her tiny attic bedroom in Margaret's house. There was a faint creaking above when the wind pushed against the roof, and sometimes she imagined her mother's voice there, not saying anything specific, just murmuring softly like wind through pine trees. But when she closed her eyes, that murmur always faded into silence. She didn't miss the noise of the previous house, the sharp tone of her stepmother, the impatient sighs of her father, the shouts from her step-siblings echoing down the hallway. But she did miss the feeling that even in the chaos, she might have belonged somewhere. Now she was a guest, a grateful one, a respectful one, but still a guest. Margaret never made her feel unwanted, but there was an invisible line Evelyn didn't dare cross. She stayed quiet, did her chores, said thank you, ate small portions, and cleaned up fast. She didn't want to risk being seen as a burden. The one place where Evelyn allowed herself to speak freely was the small library in town. It was only open 4 days a week, but every moment there felt like a breath of warm air in the middle of a snowstorm. Miss Lenora, the librarian, was in her 60s and wore thick glasses that always slid down her nose. She never asked Evelyn why she was always there, but she did start setting aside books she thought she'd like: historical fiction, personal essays, biographies of women who had rebuilt their lives from nothing. You always come back for the heavy stuff, Miss Lenora once remarked with a twinkle in her eye. Evelyn gave a small smile. Light stuff never stays with me. It was during one of those afternoons in the library that Evelyn first read about community grant programs. Small-scale funding offered to young adults who wanted to start something of value: businesses, social initiatives, creative spaces. She read the application instructions 3 times, heart thudding in her chest. The idea that she could start something, not just survive something, felt like being handed a blank canvas for the first time. Later that evening, she sat at Margaret's kitchen table long after dinner, the grant information spread out before her. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. What would she even propose? She thought back to all the kids she had met at her after-school job at the local diner, teenagers who walked through snow without proper coats, young girls who whispered about going home to places that didn't feel like homes, boys who scoffed at help but lingered near the warmth of the coffee machine just a bit too long. Maybe, just maybe, she could build something for them. A warm space, a resource center, nothing too ambitious. Just a place where young people could find secondhand coats, ask questions, or just sit somewhere that wasn't cold. She typed through the night. By the time the sky turned the soft gray of morning, her eyes burned, but her application was done. The Hearth Project, she titled it. Just before submitting it, she reread her closing line. This is not just about coats. It's about being told you matter when no one else ever has. She clicked submit. Then, Evelyn sat back, unsure if she'd just written her future or a beautifully worded nothing. Winter turned into a reluctant spring. Evelyn's life fell into a routine. Wake at 6. Help Margaret prep her bakery deliveries. Work a few shifts at the diner. Walk to the library. Eat dinner. Sleep. She didn't hear back from the grant board for weeks. She told herself not to get her hopes up, but she also found herself drafting follow-up emails, imagining what the space could look like, sketching ideas in the margins of library books. One afternoon in late April, as cherry blossoms began to dot the sidewalks of Maple Hollow, she returned home from work to find a letter on the kitchen counter. Her name was handwritten on the front in large, careful letters. She stared at it for nearly a minute. When she opened it, her hands trembled. She read the first line 4 times before it sank in. Congratulations! You have been selected as one of this year's recipients of the Young Changemakers Grant in upstate New York, she gasped. Margaret, who had just walked in, looked at her with wide eyes. Evelyn? Are you okay? Evelyn held out the letter, tears blurring the words now. I got it. I got the grant. Margaret's eyes welled up immediately. Oh, honey. They hugged awkwardly at first, then tightly. And for the first time since stepping into this house, Evelyn didn't feel like a guest anymore. She felt like someone who belonged. The space that would become the Hearth Project wasn't much to look at, just an old hardware store at the edge of Maple Hollow's small downtown strip. The windows were clouded with years of dust, and the inside smelled like damp wood and old paint. But to Evelyn, it was beautiful. The grant money wasn't enormous, but it was enough to cover 6 months' rent on the space and the initial costs of materials and permits. The rest, she decided, she'd figure out along the way. That was how she'd always done it, one step, one breath, one stubborn refusal to give up at a time. Margaret came with her the first day, holding a thermos of tea and a box of old dish towels. Every project worth doing starts with a little elbow grease, she said. They started cleaning. For hours, Evelyn swept, scrubbed, and pulled splinters from her palms. By the end of the day, her arms ached and her shirt was stained with dust and sweat. But when she looked around, she could finally see the bones of what the place could become. A reading corner by the window, a rack of donated winter coats by the entrance, shelves of hygiene kits, a bulletin board for local job listings and support programs. She wanted it to feel like a place that noticed you even if the world hadn't. The next morning, Evelyn returned alone. She spread her blueprints across the counter and spent the next few hours tracing every inch of her idea with a pencil she had sharpened down to a stub. Midway through the afternoon, she heard a knock on the glass. She turned. It was Ethan. He'd been her manager at the diner when she first started working there, barely 16 and too nervous to carry 2 plates at once. Since then, he'd always looked out for her, a quiet kind of support that never asked for thanks. He stepped inside, holding a worn-out toolbox. I heard you're trying to build a revolution in here, he said with a grin. Evelyn laughed. Just a place to stay warm. Same thing, he said. Need a hand? From that moment on, people started showing up. First, it was Ethan and Margaret. Then Miss Lenora from the library, who brought 3 cartons of gently used books and a donation jar that had Keep Kids Warm scribbled in Sharpie. A local contractor named Will offered to help rewire the overhead lights at cost. A few of the teenagers from the diner painted the back wall with a mural of a fire burning in the middle of a forest clearing. Word spread. People began dropping off coats and scarves and boxes of shampoo. A woman Evelyn didn't know slipped her a check for $500 and whispered, "My sister could have used something like this back when we were kids." Evelyn kept waiting to feel like an imposter. She kept waiting for someone to walk in and say, "Who gave you the right?" But no one did. They just kept showing up. By November, the Hearth Project had officially opened its doors. On the first day, a teenage boy Evelyn recognized from the high school walked in, his hands jammed into the sleeves of a hoodie that was clearly 2 sizes too small. He didn't say much, just nodded, took a coat off the rack, and left. Evelyn stood by the window and watched as he zipped it up outside and walked down the street. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. She just stood still, holding that moment like a fragile flame. One night later that week, she sat across from Margaret in the warm glow of the kitchen, sipping tea. "You've changed this place," Margaret said gently. "I haven't done anything special," Evelyn replied. "I just made space." Margaret looked at her carefully. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. But not everything was easy. In December, someone broke into the hearth. They didn't take much, just a few boxes of coats, a small donation jar, but they smashed a window, rifled through drawers, and left the place cold and broken. When Evelyn saw it, her throat tightened. It wasn't about the money. It was the invasion. The sense that this small, safe space she had fought for wasn't safe anymore. She sat on the floor of the coat room, glass crunching under her boots, her eyes burning. Not just from anger, but from exhaustion. She had worked so hard, and now this. Ethan came by when he heard, toolbox in hand again. He didn't say much, just fixed the window and reinforced the door with a sturdier lock. "You okay?" he asked before he left. "I'm tired," she admitted. "That's because you care," he said. "The world can't break you unless you're doing something that matters." The next day, 2 teenage girls showed up after school. They had brought gloves and cleaning supplies. "We heard," one of them said, not meeting Evelyn's eyes. "We want to help." The space was cleaned within hours. The shelves restocked. A new security light was installed. People donated double what they had before. The hearth project didn't fall apart. It grew stronger. Christmas came and went. Jonah, Evelyn's quiet, kind boyfriend who worked as a part-time mechanic in Troy, visited for the holidays and helped install shelving units in the back. They had started dating in the spring, but their bond had deepened in recent months. He wasn't just a comfort, he was a believer. In her, in what she was building. They sat on the steps of the hearth one snowy evening, watching the town's square lights flicker on across the street. "You ever think about everything that had to go wrong for you to end up right here?" Jonah asked. Evelyn smiled softly. "All the time." He handed her a wrapped package. Inside was a thick black winter coat, soft, sturdy, with fleece-lined pockets and a silver zipper. She looked up at him, startled. "I know you can buy your own now," he said. "But I thought you should have one that you didn't have to earn." She blinked, overwhelmed, and slid her hand into the pocket. There, folded neatly, was a small card. It read, "Because no one should ever have to prove they're worth being warm." That night, Evelyn didn't fall asleep afraid of the cold. She fell asleep dreaming of spring. When Evelyn opened the doors to the old fire station that morning, the air inside was as crisp as the frost still clinging to the windows. A shaft of light streamed through the high windows, catching dust motes in its path. The warmth of her small electric heater had barely kicked in yet, but inside her chest, something steadier had begun to burn. She knelt down by the stack of newly arrived materials, donated second-hand couches, a box of mismatched board games, 2 battered bookshelves, and started sorting. This wasn't just a community center anymore. This was the Hearth Project. And it was hers. The name had come to her during a quiet walk around town the week before, after she'd helped an elderly woman named Marjorie carry groceries back to her porch. Marjorie had gripped her hand tightly and said, "You have a calming presence, dear. Like a hearth in winter. A hearth." The kind of word that felt rooted, solid, warm. And suddenly Evelyn saw it all so clearly, what this space was meant to be. Not just a room with donated furniture. Not a charity case. A hearth. A place of warmth for those who, like her, had once been left out in the cold. As she worked, footsteps approached behind her. She didn't need to look to know it was Theo. His quiet boots, the soft rustle of his coat, the unspoken rhythm they'd settled into over weeks of early mornings and late-night planning sessions. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, hers just the way she liked it, heavy on cream, a dash of cinnamon. "You were here before sunrise again," he said gently, handing her the mug. Evelyn shrugged, smiling. "You were just 5 minutes behind." He grinned and leaned on the doorframe, watching her. "It's starting to look like something, you know?" "It is something," she corrected. "It's ours." There was a weight behind those words. A quiet truth they both felt but rarely voiced. The town had started to notice. Slowly. A teenager named Cassie had begun volunteering on weekends, helping repaint the walls. an old army vet named Gerald brought in a dusty chessboard and started hosting quiet tournaments with local kids. A single mom from the trailer park, Rosa, came in with her two boys and cried when she realized there was a place her kids could read and be safe for a few hours. Evelyn had created that. Her. The girl who'd once stood in hand, me-down shoes watching her stepfamily eat dinner without setting a place for her. Now she set the table. That afternoon, Evelyn received a letter in a cream-colored envelope with familiar cursive. Her hand trembled as she turned it over. It was from her father. She hadn't heard from him since the day he stood silently while her stepmother packed Evelyn's things into garbage bags and left them on the porch. But here it was, unmistakably his handwriting, neat and rehearsed. She waited hours before opening it. She cleaned the donated coffee table. She helped Cassie hang a chalkboard with the words, "This week at the hearth," in bright pink letters. She watched the sun sink lower through the long windows. Then, when the place was empty and the last light of day had turned gold, she slid her finger beneath the seal. "Evelyn, I saw the article in the Gazette. I didn't know what to say until now. I still don't. But I want to say something. You've built something beautiful, and I'm sorry I wasn't someone who saw that in you earlier. I let someone else dictate how you were treated, and I've lived with that. I'll understand if you don't want to hear from me. I just needed you to know. I was wrong. I hope you're warm this winter. Dad." She read it 3 times, folded it, tucked it into the drawer of the front desk beside the emergency contact forms and extra pencils. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she turned off the lights, stepped outside, and locked the doors behind her. The cold air bit at her cheeks, but something in her had grown warmer. Forgiveness wasn't immediate, but maybe it had a place somewhere down the line. By the end of January, the Hearth Project had become the talk of the town. The local elementary school sent a few kids over after class for homework help. Theo's construction buddy, Ken, donated materials for a kitchenette. Evelyn was up late most nights reworking budgets and grant letters, her old laptop barely holding on. One night, while she and Theo were sorting donated winter gear, he paused mid-fold, holding a bright purple scarf. "You've been running on fumes, Evelyn. When was the last time you did something just for you?" She blinked at him. "This is for me." He shook his head. "This is your mission. But what about joy?" That question hung in the air. Joy. Had she forgotten about joy? It came back to her later that week, unexpectedly, in the form of music. Gerald had brought his old guitar, sat by the window, and played softly. One of the little boys, Mateo, danced without rhythm in the middle of the room. Evelyn laughed an unguarded, belly-deep laugh. Joy. She was beginning to find it again. Word of the Hearth Project reached Albany by February. A nonprofit rep stopped by to tour the center. A woman in a sleek navy coat with an iPad and polished shoes. She watched the interactions. She asked questions. She smiled. "I think we can help you scale this," she said, handing Evelyn her card. "This could be statewide, Evelyn." Later, Evelyn stared at the card. She wasn't sure what scared her more, failing or succeeding. She called Theo. "What if it's too big for me?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Then we make it big enough for you." She closed her eyes and smiled. This was just the beginning. The idea of expansion settled over Evelyn like a gentle snowfall, quiet at first, and then all-consuming. After the nonprofit rep left, the card she'd been given lived on the edge of her desk for 3 days, untouched. Theo nudged her gently every time he passed it, raising an eyebrow but never pushing. On the 4th day, Evelyn called. The conversation was brief but promising. The rep's name was Julia Hart, and she spoke with the calm precision of someone who'd seen both successes and failures and still believed in trying. "We've got a grant cycle opening soon," she said. "I'd be happy to nominate the Hearth for it. But we'll need a formal proposal, financials, and a growth plan." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I'll get it to you." That night, after the volunteers went home and Theo fell asleep on the couch with a half-finished tax form resting on his chest, Evelyn pulled out her laptop. She began to type. She wrote about warmth, about community, about the girl who grew up in silence and how she now built a space where people could be heard. She wrote about the moments that mattered: the first time Gerald brought in a chessboard, the time Rosa found her son curled up on the couch reading a book instead of getting into trouble at the park. She included photos, handwritten thank you notes, donation logs, and when she hit send, her hands trembled. In mid-February, a storm blew in from the lake. Snow blanketed every rooftop and left the roads glassy. The hearth was quieter than usual. Fewer people came out in weather like this. Evelyn used the time to reorganize the supply room and plan upcoming events. That afternoon, the front door creaked open, and in walked someone she hadn't seen in years, Lauren, her stepsister. She stood in the doorway wearing an expensive coat and wet designer boots, her expression unreadable. Evelyn stood still, one hand still holding a roll of painter's tape. "Hi," Lauren said, her voice softer than Evelyn remembered. "This is yours?" "It is," Evelyn replied. Lauren looked around, taking in the colorful posters, the hand-sewn cushions, the smell of something warm and faintly cinnamony in the air. "I saw the article. Online. Grandma Betty shared it on Facebook." "Didn't know she had Facebook," Evelyn muttered before she could stop herself. Lauren gave a small smile. "She only uses it to brag about her garden and occasionally share misinformation about moon phases." She paused, serious again. "But she shared you, said you were doing something real, important." Evelyn said nothing. Lauren stepped forward, hands in her coat pockets. "I didn't come here to pretend we were ever close. I wanted you to know I see it now. What we were, what we weren't." The words landed somewhere beneath Evelyn's ribs. "I used to think you were just quiet, weird, distant. But looking back, it wasn't that. You were surviving." A silence stretched between them. "I'm sorry," Lauren said, "for the way I ignored it. For laughing when Mara made her little jabs. For pretending it was normal." Evelyn's throat was tight. She looked down at her fingers, dry and paint-flecked, then back at Lauren. "Why now?" Lauren hesitated. "Because I have a daughter now. And if someone ever made her feel like she didn't belong." She shook her head, eyes glassy. I wouldn't survive it." Evelyn didn't forgive her. Not yet. But she didn't turn her away either. She offered Lauren a seat and poured her a cup of coffee. Sometimes the door didn't need to slam shut. Sometimes it could stay cracked, just enough to let the light in. By March, the grant was approved. $20,000. Enough to install proper heating. Enough for a part-time staff member and new program materials. Julia called personally to congratulate her. "You've got something people believe in, Evelyn," she said. "Use it well." With the money came new challenges. Scheduling, HR paperwork, training. Evelyn hired Cassie as an assistant coordinator, barely 19 but smart, driven, and kind to her core. Gerald took on a mentoring program for teens. Theo stayed by her side, helping with logistics, grounding her when she drifted too far into worry. The hearth wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. And then her phone rang. It was her father. She stared at the name on the screen for a long time before answering. "Hello? Evelyn." His voice was hesitant, older than she remembered. "I heard about the grant." "Congratulations." "Thanks," she said quietly. "I'd like to see it sometime." "What you've built." Evelyn hesitated. "Why?" A pause. "Then, because I need to see what love looks like when it's done right." Her breath caught. She didn't say yes, but she didn't hang up either. On a sunny Saturday in April, Evelyn hosted the first community art day. Kids painted tiles that would later be grouted into the garden wall. Parents brought snacks. Local musicians played acoustic covers of familiar songs. It was chaotic and loud and full of messy, beautiful life. Near the end of the day, as she stood outside by the fresh beds of tulips they'd planted, Evelyn heard a voice behind her. "You did this." She turned. Her father stood a few feet away, looking awkward and tentative. He wore an old jacket and a newer expression, something raw, open, searching. "I didn't think you'd come," she said. "I almost didn't," he admitted. They stood in silence. Evelyn watched a little girl with braids help a boy glue a tile into place. Gerald was laughing with Rosa near the coffee table. Theo waved from inside, mouthing okay. She nodded. Evelyn looked back at her father. "This place is about moving forward," she said. "Not pretending the past didn't happen. Just not letting it define everything." He nodded, eyes shining. "Then I'm proud of you," he said softly. "Even if I wasn't there to say it sooner." Evelyn didn't cry. She smiled. And for the first time in years, she felt it without guilt. She was home. Summer arrived like a promise, long, golden evenings, laughter echoing down quiet streets, the scent of lilacs and grilled corn in the air. For the first time in years, Evelyn Ross allowed herself to pause. Not stop, she could never fully stop, but pause. Long enough to see what she had built. The Hearth Project had grown far beyond its modest beginnings. The old community center, once drafty and dim, now pulsed with light and energy. They had reading circles, resume workshops, music nights, a youth leadership program. People came in bruised by the world and left standing taller. And Evelyn, once the quiet girl with threadbare sleeves, had become someone people looked to when they needed hope. One morning in July, she sat on the back steps with Penny the dog at her feet, sipping coffee while the garden buzzed. Theo was off coordinating a neighborhood compost program. Cassie was inside running a creative writing class. Gerald was teaching chess. The place ran like a living organism now. Evelyn opened her notebook and began writing a letter not because it was required, but because her heart needed it. Dear Miss S. Kim, you probably don't remember me. I was the girl in third period civics who never raised her hand, the one who forgot her textbook, the one with silence stitched into her sleeves. You once stayed after class and asked if everything was okay at home. I lied. But I still remember that question. I remember your voice. It was the first time I felt like maybe someone saw me. So, thank you. You probably never knew that those small kindnesses questions asked gently, patience offered freely left roots. I think you'd be glad to know that they grew into something real. With gratitude, Evelyn Ross, founder and director, the Hearth Project, she mailed the letter the same day. The next morning, she received another message, this one from Julia Hart. Subject, recognition nomination, Evelyn. I'm thrilled to let you know that you've been nominated for the State Humanitarian Impact Award. The nomination came from multiple sources, including a few of the families your center has supported. The awards ceremony is in Albany this fall. We'd love for you to attend. Warmly, Julia Evelyn stared at the screen. The girl who once hid behind coats too thin for the weather was now being recognized at the state level. She thought about her 16-year-old self, walking to school in freezing wind, clutching a borrowed coat like armor. That girl would never have imagined this. But Evelyn didn't cry. She breathed in, felt the sunlight on her skin, and smiled. Quietly, powerfully. She would go. At the ceremony in Albany, Evelyn stood at a podium in a navy blue dress she'd borrowed from Rosa. Her palms sweated despite the air conditioning. The room was full of powerful people, politicians, executives, educators. She felt impossibly small for a heartbeat. Then she looked out and saw Theo in the front row, his grin steady and true. Cassie and Gerald flanked him, both holding up small handmade signs. We, you, Evelyn. And behind them, unexpectedly, almost impossibly, was her father. He didn't wave, he didn't call out, but his hands were clasped tightly in his lap, and his eyes never left her. She began. My name is Evelyn Ross, she said, voice shaking but firming with each word. And for a long time, I believed that silence was safety, that staying quiet, staying small, was the best way to survive. But what I've learned is that community is louder, braver, that when we show up for each other, healing isn't just possible, it's inevitable. A hush fell over the room. The Hearth Project was never about me, she continued. It's about every kid who was told they weren't worth a warm meal or a second chance. It's about the neighbors who came together when no one else would. It's about building the home you wish you had so someone else doesn't have to dream it alone. She paused. And I think that's what real success looks like, not being the loudest in the room, but being the one who listens when no one else does. The applause started slow, then rose like a wave. When Evelyn stepped down from the stage, tears in her eyes, she was greeted by her team, Theo hugging her tightly, Cassie crying into Gerald's shoulder. Later that night, as they drove back toward upstate New York in a van full of half-eaten snacks and sleepy laughter, Evelyn watched the trees blur past the window and let herself feel it all. In the weeks that followed, the Hearth story made headlines. A local journalist featured Evelyn in a profile titled, The Quiet Fire That Built a Home. Donations increased. A grant from a national foundation followed. Plans began for a second hearth location in a neighboring town. Evelyn wasn't chasing visibility, she was chasing impact, and it was working. One October morning, Evelyn returned to the lake, the same one her family used to visit when she was little, back when things still felt whole. She stood on the dock, hands in her coat pockets, watching the early mist roll across the water. She didn't come here for nostalgia. She came because it was hers now, this peace, this clarity, this life. Behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn right away. Didn't think you'd find the place, she said softly. I remembered, her father replied. They stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, not reaching but not retreating either. You've come far, he said eventually. I didn't do it alone. He nodded. I'm trying, Evelyn. I know it's late, but I am. She looked at him, really looked. The lines on his face, the slope of his shoulders, the regret in his eyes. I know, she said. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, just truth. That winter, the Hearth launched a new program, Project Ember, a mentorship initiative for teens in unstable households. Evelyn oversaw the training herself. At the first session, she handed each new mentor a small object, a smooth, palm-sized stone, engraved with just one word, steady. It's a reminder, she said, that when the world rushes past, sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is the rock in the river. And as she looked around that room at the lives quietly changing, at the warmth built from pain, Evelyn finally understood. She wasn't the girl left behind anymore. She was the one leading the way.